The revolution ends with the Napoleonic era beginning from 1799 and lasting until 1815. So our guiding question here is, why did Napoleon Bonaparte assume control of France, and what factors led to his downfall? Here's a brief overview. Oh, isn't he gorgeous? He led a military dictatorship for about 15 years in France. His goal was to create civil peace and order, much like the enlightened despots. He wanted an empire promoting liberalism, so he wanted to take it a step further. This was his appeal to the people. After all of the chaos of the French Revolution, people really desired a strong ruler. Remember Abbé Sieyès, author of What is the Third Estate? He once favored popular rule, but now his slogan was confidence from below, authority from above. So he's changed his tune. They want a strong ruler. Napoleon worked with conspirators and was named first consul after the military coup that took place in 1799. He promised the middle class a civil code, which he gave them in 1804, and it ensured the equality of all male citizens under the law and absolute security of wealth and private property. This should remind you, of course, of John Locke. He created a Bank of France, and it served the interests of the state and private wealth, and he reaffirmed land and status gains of peasants, so he had a great appeal to both peasants and the middle class. Some of his bureaucratic reforms included centralizing the state in the tradition of the revolutionary governments. He granted amnesty to the émigrés, which is what the nobles who tried to leave France were called, only if they returned and swore loyalty to the new state. He enlisted both non-radical revolutionaries and former nobles, so he's basically trying to bring people together here. He creates them, gives them positions of state ministers, prefects, which is just sort of like local officers, and mayors, and he rewarded military people with titles. Okay, now Napoleon and the Catholic Church are not going to get along here. He tried to heal the religious divide between the clergy who swore allegiance to the state during the French Revolution and those who refused to do so, who went into hiding. With the Concordat of 1801, French Catholics could practice religion, but the state still nominated bishops and paid the clergy. This move did help to promote social harmony. His domestic reforms, we can sort of sum all these up into the Napoleonic Code. The Napoleonic Code's purpose was to reorganize the legal code to reflect the ideals of the Revolution, which is basically liberalism. It divided civil law into three categories: personal status, property, and the acquisition of property. Much of the administrative reorganization actually is still around in France today, so he did a pretty good job. Women, however, did not fare well under Napoleon. They were not recognized as legal citizens, and they still had to be subordinate to husbands and fathers. He basically upkept the social norms of the time. He also, in the interest of a strong state, suppressed free speech. And he had this guy Fouché. He was the minister of police, and he maintained pretty much a police state later on in Napoleon's reign. There were 2,500 political prisoners by 1814, so this guy was kind of power hungry. This is a painting of the Napoleonic Code, and it looks like, well, we can interpret this photo in class. This is a pretty hardcore photo, but or picture, I should say. This is the Napoleonic Code. Haitian independence did not go well for Napoleon. They freed the slaves in Haiti. There was still some issues. Essentially, the Haitians are going to rise up and claim their own independence. This will greatly weaken Napoleon. You should have read about that in McKay. Moving on, the continental system. The goal of the continental system was to isolate Britain and promote Napoleon's mastery over Europe. Remember, things have been going back and forth between Great Britain and France pretty much since the beginning of the 18th century. Great Britain is the new up-and-coming power, thank you, Elizabeth, and they've got all these colonies. France lost much of its control over the New World to Great Britain during the 7 Years' War, all the way back under Louis XV. So Napoleon wants to sort of get Great Britain out of the picture. He did not allow any of his conquered territories to purchase British ships. British ships were not allowed in any European ports that he controlled. It's pretty much what you need to know. Eventually, these edicts are going to lead to the United States declaring war on Britain, and that is, of course, the War of 1812. So, how do we go from First Consul Napoleon to Emperor Napoleon I? Well, he just declared himself emperor in 1804. Remember, people really wanted a strong ruler, so they were like, oh, that's not a bad idea. He really had quite a big ego. He fancied himself to be like Charlemagne, and he wanted to be ordained by the Pope, just like Charlemagne was. However, Charlemagne, back when he was crowned emperor of the Frankish Empire in around the year, oh geez, you're testing me, around 800, about 1,000 years before Napoleon, Charlemagne knelt down and the Pope was like, I hereby ordain you Emperor of the Frankish Empire. Napoleon, though, actually took the crown from the Pope and proclaimed himself Emperor. Yikes. He also then crowned Josephine, his beloved wife, his deeply beloved wife, the Empress of France. This did not please the Pope very much, kind of embarrassed him. This is a painting of the coronation, and you can see here the Pope is looking pretty angry here at Napoleon as he is crowning Josephine, his Empress. Josephine and Napoleon have just a beautiful love story. They're madly in love with each other. You can see this is Josephine here. She's a very beautiful woman, and there are just stories after stories after stories all about their love for each other. We'll talk more about that later. Unfortunately, they'll have to get divorced because she cannot produce an heir. It was very sad. Anyway, here's a map of the continental system. All of these areas here in pink are areas barred or prevented from importing British goods because they are all controlled by Napoleon. Okay? This is a terrible map as I'm looking at this. Eventually, these are the ones in pink are the earlier lands, and then the ones in this kind of dark blue come later on. These are later conquered territories that will all eventually be barred from importing British goods. Sorry, that was confusing. The Grand Empire, as Napoleon called it, could not last forever. Essentially what happened is he had a lot of military victories in the beginning of his reign, all the way up through 1810. He then implemented what he called satellite kingdoms, kingdoms that related back to France, and he took out their traditional rulers, people like the Habsburgs, and he put in his family members. Eventually, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, who were never fully conquered by Napoleon, became like ally states because they just cannot beat him militarily. All of these people all these countries, I should say, are expected to support Napoleon's continental system and just completely stop trade with Great Britain. So what is the impact of the Grand Empire of France on European society? Well, it introduced French laws everywhere. Every place that Napoleon took over abolished feudal dues and serfdom, and they were supposed to pay heavy taxes. So even though in the eyes of France, Napoleon was seen as a liberator, the people whom he conquered saw him more as a conqueror because, of course, they had to pay all these taxes. There were many nationalistic revolts against Napoleon. People saying, no, I'm proud to be, a Hungarian, and we don't want to be ruled by France. This is going to pretty much lead us right to World War I. Then we have what's called the Spanish Ulcer. Catholics, monarchists, and patriots revolted against French rule in Spain. The revolt was unsuccessful for years until finally Great Britain's support finally pushed the French out in 1813. This famous painting here by Francisco Goya is entitled The 3rd of May, 1808, and it depicts a gruesome and brutal massacre of Spanish nationals by the French conquerors. It's a very powerful painting. And then we have the Russian debacle. Much like Hitler will later do in the 20th century, Napoleon makes the mistake of invading Russia in June. Now, Alexander I was like, no, I don't want to listen to you about the continental system. And so Napoleon takes 600,000 troops to invade Russia to try and get them to, obey the continental system. The Russian army, and of course the winter, and thereby starvation, took the lives of 375,000 of Napoleon's troops, and then 200,000 were later taken prisoner. So virtually he lost all of his troops. It's tragic. They just uncovered, actually, recently in history, they recently uncovered like some mass graves of basically troops that froze to death. It's very sad. Now, despite Napoleon's popularity and unprecedented military victory, he was finally forced to abdicate. I apologize, that should say April 4th, 1814. That's a typo. Napoleon was forced to abdicate because finally Europe, basically all of Europe, had to invade Paris twice. It took them twice. So what happened was Napoleon was arrested, and they were like, you have to abdicate the throne, like give up the throne. And he was like, yeah, like I will, but only if you make my son emperor. And they were like, no, that's not how it works. And he's like, well, then it's on again. And they're like, then they have to defeat him again in Paris. And they're like, no, seriously, Napoleon, stop it. You can't be the emperor anymore. We won. He's like, fine. So they force him to live on this island called Elba. And this is a political cartoon of Napoleon all frustrated, sitting there on Elba all by himself. It wasn't a bad life. He was still paid 2 million francs a year. And they're like, please just go away. We don't want you in Europe anymore. In the meantime, while Napoleon is sulking there on the island of Elba, we have the impending restoration of the Bourbons, maybe? Louis XVIII reigned then from 1814 until 1824. He issued what's called a constitutional charter, recognizing many changes and guaranteeing civil liberties. It was very similar to the Constitution of 1791. So, at this point, France still has a constitutional monarchy under Bourbon Louis XVIII. Not grandson, but I think he's like a nephew of Louis XVI. Remember, Louis XVII, the Dauphin, died when he was 10 years old because he was sick and died in prison. However, Napoleon comes back. In February of 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba, and he was so vastly popular, he literally rode into Paris and said, "Hey, let's go take over Europe, who's with me?" And the army was like, "Yeah, cool, let's go." And so he raised an army and set out to reconquer Europe, and he went on for 100 days. They couldn't stop him. He was successful until he lost infamously at the Battle of Waterloo in Great Britain, June 18th, 1815. Gotta love Napoleon. You just can't stop him. He's unstoppable. End of the era, Napoleon. I love this painting. Look, he's like got that deep melancholy in his eyes. Napoleon was banished to St. Helena off the coast of Africa, even further than Elba. They still restored Louis XVIII again. Napoleon, in his last days, wrote his memoirs and fostered his legend as the liberator of Europe. So that's all I have for you on Napoleon. Enjoy. Have a wonderful day. I will see you tomorrow.